All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Thanks for joining. I'm Katie Henke, Director of Business Development at Nathan Associates. Wanted to start this morning with the acknowledgement of country. New to this, so excuse me. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past, present, and emerging. Good morning. So Nathan Associates is an economic consulting firm. We've been doing some work with DFAT, in different places in the region. We also do quite a bit of work with the U.S. government, the UK government, and several multilateral institutions. I think, today we wanted to have a discussion on the emerging debt crisis. I have, several panelists to introduce. I'm standing in for Jeff Singer, who unfortunately couldn't make it today, so you'll have to bear with me. So first we'll start, I'll just introduce the panelists. They'll each have some opening remarks, and then we'll have 3 segments to the discussion, and hopefully have some time for questions at the end. Without further ado, I want to welcome the panelists. Thank you so much for joining. I guess we'll start. Uzma Ashraf Barton is a principal associate at Nathan, where she leads our expanding portfolio of domestic resource mobilization, decentralization, and public financial management work throughout Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. She's worked for over 15 years with national governments, the World Bank, and other donors on broadening fiscal space through policy and administrative actions, and sustainably increasing revenue resources through successful reform implementation. Prior to that, she advised the multilateral institutions in Asia, including Asian Development Bank, think tanks like the Atlantic Council, and Research Grants Council Hong Kong, and the People's Republic of China on wide-ranging issues related to legal aspects of financial market development, financial inclusion, and global markets and foreign policy. Previously, Ms. Barton was Deputy Commissioner at the Federal Board of Revenue in Islamabad, Pakistan, where she led the countrywide implementation of World Bank-funded tax reform projects. I guess I won't go on, Uzma, you have a long and illustrative career, but perhaps you'd like to give us some opening remarks.
Sure, thanks, Katie, for the introduction. And special thanks to the organizing committee for putting on this conference. As much as I can imagine, it's exciting to be there at the conference, and even virtually for us joining here. Sadly, the challenges that development architecture is facing globally are sobering. In the next few minutes, I'll be talking about 2 aspects. First, I have a little bit of sore throat, but first, providing an overview of the current economic challenges that the world is facing, and secondly, some of the viable options, especially for lower and middle income countries, and how they can address these challenges. To underscore the current economic challenges, I cite a few indicators. 1, in 2020, the year COVID-19 hit us, the world's GDP, or gross product, fell by 4.3%. Please note that was the sharpest contraction of global output since the Great Depression of 1930s. Second, global debts rose to 256% of GDP in 2020. Please note it surpassed the levels of debts that we had in the World War II. Although the advanced economies in China accounted for more than 90% of the initial something like 28 trillion debt surge in 2020. However, today over 58% of world's poorest countries are in debt distress or are at the high risk of it. The final indicator that I would highlight is to flag IMF's latest global economic outlook, which forecasts growth to slow down from 6% the last year to 3.2% for this year, and further receding to 2.7% in 2023. Please also note that this is the bleakest outlook since the global financial crisis in 2008, and comes with a warning from the IMF, and I quote, that the worst is yet to come. This brings us to two questions. How much of this economic distress is caused by COVID-19, and why lower and middle income countries are more vulnerable to these crises? Let's take a step back and look at pre-COVID indicators. In 2019, the share of public debt rose from 72 to 105% of GDP for advanced economies. It rose from 35 to 54% of GDP for middle income countries, and from 14 to 44% of GDP for lower income countries. Please note that the debt to GDP tripled for the LICs for the lower income countries just before the COVID hit us. Then, as a response to COVID-19, countries employed fiscal and monetary policy tools to offset COVID-19 impact. And we saw global increases in public and private debts in all types of economies during the 2020s. Now let's look at why lower and middle income countries are more vulnerable to debt distress compared to the advanced economies. Despite that, the advanced economies incurred higher debts during the COVID-19, but they also have a higher ability to raise debts at a much lower cost than the lower income countries, less than 1/3 of the cost. 37 low and middle income countries eligible for the G20's debt suspension initiative spent more on debt servicing than on health during 2020. Data shows that developing countries' debt payments in 2021 were at the highest point since 2001. Also in 2020, the number of people living below poverty line, extreme poverty line, rose by 70 million. This was the largest increase since 1990s. And on the revenue side, global tax revenues declined by 12%, whereas global revenues declined by 15% for lower income countries. So this brings me to the second issue. Where do we go from here? What if any sustainable options to finance these development needs? How can countries balance the essential spending in health, education, food, climate, and whatnot, with the need to make repayments and the need to cut back on borrowing costs? Surprisingly, lower and middle income countries have significant untapped fiscal space to raise their own finances. These untapped tax gaps are real. As a tax policy person, I recognize that the tax adjustments can impact economic growth. However, lower and middle income countries can tap into at least the following three sources of domestic revenues without compromising economic growth. One, by cutting down wasteful tax expenditures incurred through granting tax incentives, exemptions, and subsidies, or at least rationalizing them. Tax policy can be used as a great tool to neutralize inflation, especially for the most vulnerable population. Second, they can increase the domestic revenues by broadening the tax base and taxing the untaxed or undertaxed sectors. Tax analysis have shown that the existing tax base in lower and middle income countries is significantly thin, both for direct and for indirect taxes. The third option is by decentralizing tax collections and spendings, making local authorities and cities empowered to raise and spend revenues for service delivery at the local level. COVID-19 has shown us the significance of strong national health system. This is medium to long-term intervention, however, but is a significant step in crisis preparedness. Emergency responses to COVID-19 also revealed the acute gaps in the responsiveness of public financial management systems, especially at the subnational levels. And that's where the donors and the development community, including implementing partners like Nathan, can tremendously support building and enhancing institutional capacity, especially for the lower income countries and lower middle income countries. That's it for now, Katie. Back to you.
Thank you, Uzma, for those helpful opening remarks, and thank you for struggling through your sore throat. I'm really sorry that you're not feeling well. Our next panelist is Secretary Andrew Owake. He's the Secretary of Papua New Guinea Department of Treasury, the most senior civil servant within the PNG Treasury. He's worked for 20 years within the government of PNG as the Deputy Secretary overseeing the policy wing of Treasury, where he was responsible for establishing the working relationship with the IMF, the first Assistant Secretary overseeing the macroeconomic and fiscal forecasting division, where he was responsible for the first budget strategy paper for PNG. And I understand he's been working very hard on the budget over the past couple weeks as well. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Secretary. We'd love to hear some opening remarks from you. If you want to unmute your microphone and go ahead and chime in.
You're still...
You're unmuted now. Go ahead.
Can't hear you,
Oh, we can't hear you.
Trying the backup option of putting a microphone in my phone.
We can do that. When do we do that?
Let's do that. Secretary, if you can hear me, we can put the microphone near my phone, and then hopefully you'll be able to hear by the room. Or maybe not.
Oh gosh.
That was a worthwhile effort, wasn't it?
We had a lot of feedback there.
It might be yeah. Okay. If you mute yourself there, Secretary, we'll just unmute you on the phone and you can speak through that. I'm going to be honest, for a call that involves people from the US, Australia, and Papua New Guinea, this is going a lot better than I thought. Let's try again. Secretary, can you hear us? Just if you mute your laptop, Secretary.
Yeah, mute the
and
speaker
turn
on
your
your
speaker on your
laptop.
laptop off. Then we should be able to feedback.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Yep, you're on, Secretary.
Thank you. My apologies for all of this, but thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to be part of this panel this morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity. First, let me start. About the PNG, we just put out the Parliament, the 2020 budget yesterday, actually. The budget is the first of the new government post-election, and as in every year was considerably a lot of work for my department, ensuring it reflects the government's priorities and policies and priorities. I won't speak too much of the policies set of the budget, as this is a preview of the treasurer, but I will speak to some of the ways that we are trying to ensure that the budget can reflect on balance policy priorities, especially those priorities included for the investment that need to bring the overall deficit down under control. PNG, like every country, saw an increase in the deficit during COVID-19. Fortunately, we had several levels of support to meet the cost, including the rapid credit facility from IMF, and a fairly deep domestic market, and also the support from some of our bilateral partners. Reducing its deficit has been stated as policy objective of the Ghanaian government, given a priority to current increasing international rates. There has been three components. One is to have a clear path of profile of borrowing over the medium term that people have been bought in and doing it. Second is finding a way to ensure that we make savings where possible. This has included removing excess slack in the public service and the administration spending. And three is reducing cost of debt, which keeps the interest cost low, freeing up funds for elsewhere. Later, we have managed to bring down domestic interest cost through a close active measures for bond markets locally. We have seen the rates fall around 3% across the yield. In addition, seeking out more concessional borrowing options, which will allow us to build a debt profile with a more spread out repayment over time, and reducing any bullet payment risk or rollover finance rates. On the second point, we have been budgeting through a process of a clear prioritization of buckets of funds. Certain funds reserved as protected, including legally required ones. We say also the fixed commitments to a degree on some of the ongoing projects which are contracted. Other funds and departments are then aligned to government prioritization and either protected or reduced depending on their priorities and the remaining funds. This has placed a requirement on departments, including my own, to find efficiencies and savings in how we work. We have several processes happening that run parallel, and next year we plan to strengthen them further with the inclusion of the process of political approval of sectoral ceiling early in the year, letting the government establish priority setting directions they rely on, or early, setting their direction early. Finally, on the first point, the government has established a 13-year plan for budget repair and construction. This seems like an unusual period for those who are in the PFM practitioners who probably more used to telling the country do 3 to 5 years as a medium-term horizon. Well, now that we can focus 13 years with 17. But in truth, no one can focus more than a year or two with a degree of reasonable accuracy. But this kind of view on the world has allowed government to put numbers in a direction to fiscal policy that focus on mind. Our 13-year period in which PNG, in theory, could repay all its international and domestic debt. To achieve this, it requires strong revenue growth, directed expansion to priority areas, and an interim target of getting the budget to surplus by 2027. At the moment, we are holding on to this plan and have been since COVID. Budget set up in Parliament yesterday can be deficit in line with this plan, and this is a large part due to the fact that the 13-year plan gives a clear goal to the government on what it wants to achieve. Thank you very much. I'm happy to go with more details on the PNG's work on my, and with my team colleague team on the other end. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary.
Thank you, Secretary. Our next panelist is Alicia Robinson Morgan from Millennium Challenge Corporation, where she's Managing Director for Africa for the Department of Compact Operations. Alicia Robinson Morgan is responsible for oversight of a multi-country Africa portfolio. In this role, she provides oversight and guidance for the development and implementation of nearly $3 billion US worth of programs focused on infrastructure, investments, and policy reforms to ensure achievement of program objectives and adherence to MCC's principles of partnership and focus on results. She is currently leading the effort to launch MCC's first regional programming. Prior to joining MCC, Ms. Robinson Morgan was Senior Principal Trade and Investment Coordinator for the Africa Bureau at the United States Agency for International Development, and was also Deputy Director and Acting Director for the Office of Africa at the U.S. Department of Commerce, where she managed programs involving U.S.-Africa economic issues. Ms. Robinson Morgan, I'll hand it over to you to lend your opening comments. Welcome.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. So as a part of my opening comments, I would actually like to share a brief PowerPoint. So let me just put that up on the screen. Can everyone see that?
Not yet.
I can see it.
There it is. I don't know what-
See it now? Okay. Everyone sees it now?
Actually, I saw it briefly and then it went away. Okay, there it is. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So I'll just walk through kind of a five-pronged approach that MCC takes with respect to its model. And first is really a focus on its mission, which is very singular, very focused, and really just kind of takes us to kind of where we work and how we work. So MCC's mission is to reduce poverty through economic growth in relatively well-governed countries. As you can see from this map of kind of where we've worked, and this is historically up to today. We have worked globally, and if we just kind of focus in on Africa in particular, where we are today is that we've invested more than $9.5 billion in Africa alone since 2004. And our global investment portfolio since 2004 is about $15 billion. And the other point to note here is just that more than 70% of our investments are focused on African countries. The next item really is to hone in on how we select the countries with whom we work. And the backbone really is our scorecards. So MCC is governed by a board of directors, and the board of directors really considers several factors in terms of determining which countries to select to work with. So, you know, one is a need-based criterion, so which determines where we can actually work. And so we work with low-income countries, and we work with the lower middle-income countries, and this is based on the GNI per capita indication here. The second kind of factor that we look at is merit-based criteria, and there are really three factors for selection. One is policy performance, and this is really measured by the scorecards, and I'll get into that in a later slide. The second really is the opportunity to reduce poverty and to generate growth. And then the final kind of component here is whether or not we actually have kind of the full funding available in order to work with the program partners. So in terms of the scorecard, so MCC measures countries' policy performance based on 20 independent indicators. So these are not indicators that we generate ourselves. These are indicators that we actually pull from independent sources. And as a part of that, countries must meet the following criteria. So must pass half the indicators overall. Second, they must pass the control of corruption indicator. And then thirdly, they must pass either the political rights or the civil liberties indicator. And then I'll just show here what a scorecard looks like. This is Malawi from FY19. I will note we just recently published our scorecards for FY23. You can find all of the scorecards on MCC's website. And so you'll see for Malawi in FY19, they have passed half the scorecard, more than half actually, but they've met that minimum threshold. They've passed the control of corruption indicator, and they've passed the democratic rights indicator. So they have overall passed the scorecard. The other item to point out here in this bucket is that we have multiple product lines. So there are three types. One is our compacts, and these are time bound by 5 years. They're 5-year grants, and they fund specific programs in partnership with the country in order to address the binding constraints to economic growth. Our average compact program size is approximately $350 million. Our second product line is threshold programs. These are a much smaller grants that are focused on policy and institutional reforms with countries actually that may not pass the scorecard. So this allows us to work with countries to kind of, potentially in the future, get them ripe and ready to possibly be able to have a compact program with us. And these programs are approximately $30 million. And then our newest product line are concurrent regional compacts. We were given the authority in 2018 by our US Congress to be able to have an additional compact for countries with whom we already are working with. And the purpose of the work must be focused on regional integration or being able to provide that kind of cross-border collaboration or focus on trade. The third bucket really hones in on what the analytical approach is that we take, what drives our investment decisions. And really this is driven by what we call kind of the first area of how we work with the country is developing the constraints analysis to economic growth. And this is when the economists from MCC work with the economists of the partner country to, develop the analytical kind of backbone as to what are those constraints to economic growth. And then along the way, there's also this effort to develop a cost benefit and beneficiary analysis. So this is just, I won't kind of go through all the nuts and bolts of this, but this is kind of a visual of if we were to identify what a problem is. In this case, it's low levels of private investment and entrepreneurship. This is what the constraints to economic growth ultimately identified. And then to just go through kind of a problem-solving set of what the possible causes are, and just kind of looking at the different options and buckets from there. So the fourth bucket is our program implementation process. One area that makes MCC unique is that our programs are country-led. So MCC does not implement the programs in the country. It's the country actually that stands up an entity that implements the programs. And this is also in coordination with MCC so that we can provide that kind of technical guidance and assistance to the counterpart organization that's in the country. So this is just a snapshot of what the investments look like by sector. This is where we are in our kind of current year and timing with our compacts and our overall investments. And you'll notice kind of the trend here is that, 24% are in transport, 19% is in energy, 15% is in agriculture, and, the numbers just kind of decrease from there. So those are kind of our largest kind of buckets that we tended to over the years to invest in. And this final piece really is the focus on evaluation and learning, which is also at the core of how we work at MCC, so that we learn from the projects that we're implementing. We have independent project evaluations, and we also just have a heavy focus on the transparency of it all. So why evaluate? Why is it important? We do think that, the crux here is the importance of the accountability. It's the accountability to kind of our own internal process of accountability. It's accountability to our U.S. Congress. It gives us the funding. It's the also accountability to our partners and making sure that they're getting what we've, kind of collaboratively put together for the program. And then also being able to kind of have that continuous learning, which is also important. And so there are two types of evaluations. One is a performance evaluation, which really just takes a step back and asks the question, did we actually implement the project successfully? And then the second type of evaluation is impact. How much of an impact did the programs have? Did we actually achieve the intended outcomes? And so this takes us kind of to our final kind of where we are. As I noted in the beginning, MCC is a fairly young agency, particularly by U.S. government standards. We're kind of in that late teenage years and approaching 20. And so we're reflecting and just trying to figure out, what are the best ways to move forward with how we provide our aid, provide our grants. And, now that we've invested $15 billion over this time frame and recognizing that, global challenges have definitely evolved, what's the vision for the agency over the next couple of decades? And so we're looking at this from a threefold perspective. One is, where do we work? And so what we found is that over the years, we've definitely kind of had our country candidate pool kind of shrink a bit and kind of working with the same partners over, 2 compacts, for example. And so we're looking at how to expand the range of countries that we can work with. And so part of this is looking if, what are the best ways to be able to expand our candidate pool. The second component is actually how we work. We do have a very rigid process, and there's definitely a lot of value in that. But I think where we're taking a step back is determining, are there ways we can be more agile? Are there ways that we can create more efficiencies? Can we streamline some of our program development efforts? And then finally, we're looking at what we actually do. As the world is evolving, we're really looking at ways to make sure that our investments are really meeting the needs of our partners. And also recognizing that, as the global economy is continuing to change and countries face new challenges, looking at some of these big ideas and big areas such as urbanization, regional integration, and the digital economy. So I'll pause there and welcome any ongoing dialogue. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Alicia. I know that there's a lot of curiosity, about MCC's model, and we look forward to learning more as the discussion progresses, and also learning the new countries that are announced in December each year. With that, I'll introduce our final panelist, Tim Robinson, who's the principal economist at Nathan. He's got 15 years experience in international development, spanning several countries and institutions. His expertise covers macroeconomic modeling and policy, data analytics, public financial management, and domestic revenue mobilization. Tim has been senior economic advisor to treasurers and deputy prime ministers for Papua New Guinea, and has worked as macroeconomic advisor for the governments of Afghanistan, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Egypt, and Uganda, among others. In PNG, he has worked with the Treasury to put in place and pass the first successful IMF program for PNG in 2 decades. He's also worked on the development of concessional loan arrangements with World Bank, IMF, Australia, JICA, ADB, and others. Over his career, he's also worked across several agencies, including IMF, the World Bank, US Treasury, and multiple others, advising and undertaking research on country strategies and economic interventions. Tim, please share some opening remarks with us.
Thank you very much. I've forgotten half of that myself. So as I'm the last speaker, I wanted to start with something dramatic. So I was going to say the era of cheap money is over, but enough people have said that now, and I don't think it's totally true. So one of the things I'm going to touch on today are 3 questions. One, how can we tell if countries are actually at risk of debt distress and what that means? Two, are there financing sources that are still available, that are concessional and cheap? And this is why I'm very glad the MCC is on the panel. And finally, how do countries promote consolidation, fiscal consolidation? If we all know they're going to have to go that way, how can you actually promote it? And the Secretary touched a little bit on this with things like PNG's 13-year plan, but I'm going to touch a little bit on what some other countries have done too. So in terms of the risk of debt, obviously, the way we look at it, Nathan, is two types of countries that fall into two pools of debt issues. One are the ones that need a haircut, and there's nothing you can do. They need to have some of their debt forgiven, or they need to take cents on the dollar on some of their bonds issued. And the other are the ones who, if they manage it properly and they don't do anything that's a bad policy choice in the next 10 years, are probably okay, and they can avoid piling on more debt into the years where they've already got big repayments. And this sort of overlaps with the way the IMF looks at the world as well. So the IMF has its DSA, its debt sustainability analysis with gradings. One of those is high risk, which is kind of that group of people who, okay, they're sustainable, they can manage it, but they have to be careful. And the other is those that are in distress, i.e. the ones that at this point need to call in the IMF and get a haircut to bondholders. That high risk category has increased. Back in 2009, about a third of LICs, low income countries, fell into that high risk category. Now it's over half, post-COVID. So the risk is increasing substantially. The other is things like credit ratings. So obviously credit ratings are imperfect because not every country has a credit rating, not every country gets them updated regularly. But again, we can see a similar risk from that. So those that are triple C plus, D or selective default on Standard & Poor's, back in, where's my number? Back a few years ago, 2019, it was 3 countries, now it's 14, with 7 of them in selective default, including Russia, Sri Lanka, Suriname, Zambia, and there's more that potentially going to fall into that category too. I won't name them, because I'm there. PNG's safe, by the way, I will say. And then the final thing is the spreads on bond rates, which we've seen increasing. We've seen increasing for emerging markets. Back in October, the emerging market average spread on US Treasuries was about 13%. As a rule of thumb, anything over 10% is usually a ballpark of no market access, i.e. you can't issue a bond. So we're talking now about most emerging market countries, or the average emerging market country, can't go to market and issue a bond anymore. Or at least not realistically. So how can they combat this? Well, so at Nathan, what we've been thinking about, obviously, haircuts are really the IMF's purview. Most people can't really get involved in that. It's something the IMF has locked down. They will help countries negotiate through debt distress and through getting haircuts and debt forgiveness through initiatives in the past, like HIPC and others. But at companies like Nathan, we're looking at how can you analyze the debt profile and figure out what instruments and what debt opportunities there are that don't injure that profile. So for example, a country might have a spike in its repayments in 3 or 4 years' time that jumps up some of its repayments. So obviously then we want to get instruments that have a 5 to 10 year grace period, something to skip that period of risk. So you need to design a little bit more carefully some of the instruments that countries are taking on. And you need to think a little bit more cleverly about how you roll over the bullet payments. So Fiji just recently rolled over its sovereign bond using a policy-based loan from, I think, the ADB. So those kind of things are what we're now starting to do with countries more and more. And some of the areas where those kind of funds are available, obviously IMF. Last year, the IMF did general allocation again. General allocation, for those who don't know, is effectively where the IMF creates money as reserves and issues it to all countries in the world. Back in 2009, when they last did it, about 20% of countries used that for budget support. This year, we don't know the number yet. Well, I'm sure the IMF do, but they haven't told me. It's probably higher, because this was more the fiscal crisis. So probably more countries used the general allocation for budget support this year. That was de facto kind of free money, depending on how you look at it. Some countries then took those pools of funds, like the US, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and moved them into a new fund the IMF has created called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. This new fund, it's experimental at the moment. The IMF hasn't decided. I think in this region only Bangladesh is currently accessing it. But that fund is supposed to help countries address really long-term balance and payments difficulties, particularly related to climate concerns. So that now is becoming a new way the IMF trying to provide additional support to countries. And then obviously you've got the standard programs, your ECF program, EFF, rapid credit facilities, precautionary access. But those are becoming a little bit more expensive, but they're still, the lending rates are still weighted down by the fact that Japan and China haven't really increased their policy rates. So the lending rate from general resources at the IMF is up to 2.5%, maybe 3% now. DRGT, the small concessional fund, is about 0.25%, or at least I think it will be in January when they will use it. World Bank, IDA allocations provide a good source of lending to countries concessionally, and a lot of the countries, particularly in this region, are either IBRD blend, so they're borrowed slightly concessionally, slightly more at market rates. But the benefit there is it acts a little bit like a guarantee. IBRD funds are lent out at the World Bank borrowing rate. So there's been a lot of talk recently to the World Bank with a AAA rating, whether or not the World Bank can lend more funds by lending to rating 6. The trade-off there is they can get more market funds, but the rating slips to AA potentially, or AAA minus, or something slightly below perfect. So they get more funds available, but they're lending them out at a slightly higher rate. And that is going to, I think, increasingly become the push, and there's been a lot of talk in DC about it, trying to push that. But IBRD rates are still better spreads, way better spreads than most countries are getting for lending rates. I think of IBRD accessing countries, the only one that gets a lower market rate than the actual IBRD rates is China at the moment. And then there's other pools of funds that World Bank and ADB and others are trying to build into some of their programming too, like funds from the Global Climate Trust. One of the things we've been trying to look at in Papua New Guinea and others too is whether or not we can blend some money from things like the Global Climate Fund, the Green Climate Fund, with programming from IBRD and IDA to get a little bit of additional funding and a little bit of additional funding at lower rates if we build climate considerations into projects or climate mitigation efforts into projects. I'm going to hurry a little bit through these because I realise I have a lot more notes than we have time for. There's become a lot more bilateral partner lending. This is geopolitical, but part of it is also strong long-term partnerships from countries, particularly in this region, but also from the US and other partners too. The US has been a little bit less common on this. I think we've largely just done budgets for Afghanistan and Liberia, to my knowledge. But this is blended with things like AIFFP, the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility Program, that provide another source of funds that are cheaper than market access funds for countries in the region. And again, that's where NCC comes in too, with grant-based funds that can help. There's also been some efforts on guarantee arrangements and partial guarantee facilities. ADB has done a little bit of work on this in the last few years. US has given guarantees in the past, I think it was in Jordan at one point. It allows countries to access market funds a little bit more cheaply, but usually it only knocks off about 300 basis points. So we're not talking a huge difference when the rate is not 13, 14, 15%, but it's something that reduces the cost a little bit. The only difficulty with some of these is things like partial guarantee facilities, but being quite difficult to found a payment price. So in order to price a partial guarantee, you need to figure out what the rate is between the normal lending rate of that country and the lending rate of the guarantor, and then figure out where in between it falls. And what you really need to do that is read the guarantee in a lot of detail and figure out when it's called, what circumstances, how much it covers. If that's the case, you find the small issuances of 500 million or something like that, most $1 aren't going to offer. So they price it at pretty much the country rate. So the sum of this is, look, there are still options out there, but what countries need more and more is people to help them, one, navigate what is a very complicated donor environment, and the need to create policy matrices and reform plans, and to align those to each other so they're not having too many things to monitor. And they also need help in addressing exactly what kind of instruments they should go for depending on their debt profile. So if their debt profile is relatively low repayments in the near term, it gives them a lot more access and a lot more options to things that are short-term lending like IMF, which I think has about a 5-year grace period and then 3 or 4 pretty big payments in a few years. But if it needs to spread them out further, then options like ADB and IDA policy-based loans are probably more practical. And on the final thing, and I'll only touch on this quickly, how can countries consolidate? So the biggest challenges we found is budgeting is obviously incremental. The Secretary touched on this a little bit. Zero-based budgeting is pretty hard to do and doesn't typically work. So you can't go back to the entire budget line by line and go, justify this, justify this, justify this. So more often than not, you find you're making small incremental changes to a pre-existing budget that's been decades and decades in the making and evolution. This means the scope for making quick cuts is pretty slim. We found that I think the average rate of consolidation on a successful IMF program, i.e. one that actually sees consolidation, is only about 0.5 percentage point of GDP a year. Actually often falls below that, and often there is no consolidation. So it's challenging to do it, and it does require some pretty severe efforts to prioritize, but it also requires a long-term focus. And this is why PMG's gone from a 30-year plan, or people go for 4 to 5-year medium-term plans, because you need to see an end goal. Especially in the politics of the country, you need to be able to point to it and go, right, we want a surplus by this year, this is how we can get to it, this is the level of deficits we need to stick to. And only that works when you're doing an annual budget cycle to go through and say, oh, remember, you said we want to get to this surplus by this point, we need to stick to this deficit. The other reason zero-based budgeting doesn't work, by the way, is that if you go line by line through the entire budget and recast it, you often find you need more money than you thought you did, so you don't make cuts. And then revenue raising, and look, I talked about this a little bit, so I won't touch on it too much, but there's obviously a lot of stuff trying to raise revenue, but that is slow going as well. So these consolidations have to be done realistically, which means ultimately countries are going to have to find financing, and they're going to have to find particularly policy-based loans. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. It was a little long, but we'll manage. All right, so I know we've already covered a lot. I think in the interest of time, I want to just ask the panelists 3 of my own questions, and then hopefully we'll have some questions from the audience as well. The first topic I think that we've already touched on a bit is debt risk. You know, with more countries seeing spikes in borrowing costs and a range of countries that are facing downgrades to their debt, as was already alluded, and some countries even facing defaults, like in Sri Lanka, or major issues on repayment. I think the rise in debt risks, increasing applications for IMF programs, and the need to handle off-the-books debt, contingent liabilities, and guarantees means countries are going to be working quickly to bring debt under control while facing myriad debt risks. So I'd like to touch a bit from the panelists on what are the types of debt risks that countries are facing and how countries can mitigate that risk. Maybe Tim, I'll turn to you quickly for some comments, and then to the Secretary and to Alicia.
Sure. Thank you. You're not sitting this up with my voice already. I mean, the biggest ones are at the moment things like exchange rate risks. A lot of debt is denominated in US dollars. The US dollar is strengthening. It's becoming more costly for countries to start paying back funds. This is why some countries are trying to look at swap arrangements. This is why some countries end up falling into fixed exchange rates, which is not an ideal solution either. And prioritizing exchange resources for debt repayment. Off-balance sheet debt is still a big risk. About 5-6 years ago, there was a lot of worry about what kind of guarantees were being issued by countries, particularly for their SOEs. That's still a risk. A lot of countries have shifted towards on-lending arrangements, and the World Bank has been pushing more countries to have both guarantee and on-lending policies. The benefit of an on-lending arrangement, where the government takes out a loan and then lends it to one of their SOEs, is at least it's on the government books, they can see it and they know it. The downside of guarantees is they're often written on a bit of side paper, no one knows what the terms are, no one knows when they can be called. Often they're not done through process or proper procedures, and some of those will only start really crawling out of the woodwork as they start to default. So that's one of the big risks. A lot of bonds were written very much to the benefit of bond holders for a long while, and were written under New York or London law or Singapore law. And they were written so it's very difficult for countries to default out of. Guarantees are often not that way, and they're written under local law. So a lot of people who have bonds issued to SOEs are going to find that they're not necessarily worth the paper they're written on if the guarantee can't be called, and that might end up becoming a gift fight between governments and bondholders. And then rollover risk is still quite big. A lot of countries have big spikes in repayments, particularly bond issuers that took opportunities in market access when rates were cheap, and now we're going to find that some of those bonds are coming due when rates are more expensive. So like the BG example, they're switching things like policy-based loans to.
Thanks, Tim. Secretary, it'd be helpful to hear from your perspective how PMG is managing some of its debt risks and what interventions you all are pursuing as examples. You have to still work out your audio.
Sorry, Secretary, we still can't hear you. Do you want me to try and call again?
Let's use the same approach we did last time, Secretary.
Works, then fix it.
Thank you.
You need to mute your speaker on your computer.
Okay, sorry, now it was better. In relation to what we do for public, in making sure we stay within our debt risk, I think it's trying to work through the budget, making sure that we find areas of where we can, not priority areas, and those areas that we can create some rooms in there to ensure that whatever resources we have still be able to meet government's priorities, but at the same time we still in the region of that sustainable range. So I think that's from the practical side of the government. These are the kind of solutions we try to look at. I think it's important is you look at what you have in terms of where you can improve efficiencies, and a lot of efforts done with a clear part to ensuring what needs to be done to making sure that the government continues to ensure people's living standard in terms of the poverty that they don't just below that line, but at the same time you create a fiscal space. In doing so, you take essential priorities. I think that's one of the new strategies that we try to practically apply. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Alicia, from the donor perspective, it'd be helpful to hear on this topic how MCC is evaluating its offerings, given the rising debt levels and sustainability issues, and be helpful to hear from you on a bit more about the MCC effect and what advice you might have for prospective countries that are seeking MCC support.
Sure. So I think this is an area where MCC really has an advantage because we are providing that grant capital. And, in terms of, I think, kind of the other aspect of how, kind of leaning into the debt question, one area that we're also kind of leaning into as well is focused on blended finance, where we're kind of focusing on those public-private partnerships in order to leverage the financing from the private sector along with that public financing. And so, I mean, for example, one of our programs in Morocco has kind of a very innovative public-private partnership model with their industrial zones, where have been able to leverage MCC's, this is just for this small portion of the compact program, but leveraging a $5 million investment with an additional private sector investment of $11 million, which will then attract over $75 million, and that increased private investment from industrial companies, and then resulting in thousands of additional jobs added. And so that's a new model that the government of Morocco has taken on. And with the success of that first industrial zone, they've also moved forward with that same model for 2 additional industrial zones. So I do think it's a space for the public-private partnership kind of focus as well. In terms of the MCC effect, I also think this is an area where you know, it really allows countries to, particularly if they're not currently eligible for that grant financing from MCC, to allow them to really like focus in on their reform policies, allowing them to really strengthen their institutions, and then also efforts to improve their data quality. And I think all of this can really go a long way, not only for them to help improve their chances of passing the scorecard, but also just in terms of helping to kind of strengthen their own institutional capacity. And I think one great example of this is actually with Cote d'Ivoire, for example. Before they became eligible for our Compact program, they kind of stood up this interministerial committee that was run actually through the Office of the President, that was entirely focused on you know, all the reform policies, all the things that would allow them to kind of get to passing the indicators on the scorecard. And ultimately they did, and are, you know, in the midst of implementing a $525 million transportation and education program. And then on the final question around, you know, how would countries kind of start that conversation with MCC? So our agency, and there's a department in particular that manages the selection and eligibility process, are always happy to meet with countries to kind of walk them through kind of what are the indicators, what's necessary. So if a country is ever interested, you know, I'm happy to kind of, you know, take on the contacts and pass those on to our relevant, my relevant colleagues at MCC. So there is a way to make that happen. Thank you.
Now, just turning to fiscal sustainability, with countries trying to get on a path of fiscal consolidation and reducing their deficits, in part because of the growing cost of borrowing funds, and in part because of the increasing pressure to demonstrate caution with public finances and avoid high debt as an escalating issue. I'd like to hear from the panel a bit on the risks of fiscal consolidation, and especially in the context of tightened economic and fiscal positions, how countries can strengthen their fiscal balances without compromising economic growth, and how countries are tapping into their existing revenue gaps. So Uzma, maybe I'll turn to you first to discuss the existing situation and options, and then again from the Secretary and from Alicia.
Sure, thanks. To fiscal consolidation, there are 2 paths. One is by increasing the revenues, and second is by decreasing the expenditures. By decreasing expenditures, that's where we are seeing that countries are already doing it. And as I highlighted in my opening comments, that health, education, and the social sectors are increasingly facing reduced support from the governments. Over 93 lower income and middle income countries have already been reducing the amount they're spending on the social services. So that's really a risk in terms of fiscal consolidation. The opportunity that is there, which again I highlighted in my opening comments, is by increasing revenues. Tim already talked a bit about the concessional financing options that the countries have at this point, and Alicia earlier mentioned about like the sources that MCC is doing with the engagement with the private sector and in terms of blended finance. But my focus is more on kind of like looking at what countries already have in terms of their revenues, that how they can increase. And there is significant support scope with the countries to increase their revenues, both on the direct taxes as well as on the indirect taxes. This is not the case for the advanced economies given the global economic situation, but for developing economies, there is a scope in terms of broadening their tax base. Recently at Nathan, we did interventions in terms of property taxation, which is one of the areas where developing countries are far behind than the advanced economies in terms of their collection from the local taxation. In advanced economies, local taxation makes up almost 5% of their GDP, whereas in lower and middle income countries, especially in the lower income countries, it's generally less than 1% of the GDP. We did intervention in the property taxation in Uganda in 10 cities, and have seen within a period of 6 months in this year an increase of about over 30% in terms of revenues for those 3 cities. So there's a lot of scope in terms of direct and indirect taxes where countries can do, especially the countries which are heavily dependent on commodity exports. Currently, what we see is with the market prices, they may be, they are a bit stable, but going forward, as the commodity prices would fluctuate, they can be at a greater danger of losing the additional revenue streams that they have. I'll keep my comments in the follow-up questions, Katie.
All right, thanks, Usman. I think the secretary is having some IT support, so maybe I'll turn to you next, Alicia, and ask, about what role you see MCC in helping countries to meet their medium-term fiscal consolidation plans, and maybe if you can give us an update on MCC's first regional compact and talk about how you all have been operationalizing that new authority.
Sure, thank you. So, I think really kind of one of the ways that we get at this is that we make sure that we align with the country's development strategies as we work to develop programs with countries. And so, I think making sure that there's that alignment can help to ensure that we're kind of helping countries to kind of stay within their kind of fiscal boundaries. And then just really honestly, just going back to the original point of that, MCC is grant financing. And so therefore, really just kind of, we're not kind of causing countries to kind of face increased difficulties from that fiscal perspective. And then also just to that point that, a lot of what we do is in the infrastructure space. So if we're already kind of providing that grant money for that large scale infrastructure, whether it's building energy transmission lines, building road segments and things like that, that's the money that we're investing in countries that they then don't have to, take from their national budgets in order to kind of fund those things. So, so I think really the core of our mission really kind of aligns with helping countries to kind of get out of that fiscal rut. In terms of updating on MCC's first regional compact, as I noted in my presentation, so the US Congress gave MCC the authority to do regional compacts in 2018. 4 years later, we're kind of finally being able to kind of mark success. And so this first one is a regional transport program with Benin and Niger. It's $504 million. And it includes also cross-border policy and institutional reform components as well, focused on customs and kind of other aspects of work between the two countries and alignment between the two countries. And so we're actually planning to sign those compact grants with the countries in the coming weeks, actually. So mid-December will be our signing ceremony, and we'll be able to kind of close the deal on that. And then once we sign, then in terms of our kind of process of how that life cycle plays out is that then that the countries, Benin and Niger, will then kind of start the implementation, or rather the pre-implementation process for those two programs. But it really is a significant milestone because we've kind of gone through a couple of different project options on regional, and for various reasons, countries have been kind of deemed ineligible during the process. And so, you know, the agency is very, very excited to be able to kind of bring this home and call it a success. So thank you.
Thanks, Alicia. Secretary, let's try your audio again and see, you know, if you could share with us some of the techniques that Papua New Guinea is using to try to consolidate its debt, and what kind of political and other challenges you're facing in that respect.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Finally. All right. Thank you. I think getting to the part of the fiscal consolidation part, I think from where we do to from Papua New Guinea, I think there's two sides of it. Obviously, one is looking at how you prioritize within your expenditure area. The other one is, of course, is broadening your base of your revenue collections. And in that part, for Papua New Guinea, in this kind of the environment and space, introducing new tax measures or new tax policies will not be effective unless you have your compliance area very much in that tax administration. I think we find that there is a lot of area that we can improve on compliance, and that will be more in terms of low-hanging fruits where you can collect more. And so the focus here, as I think 3 years ago, with the support of the multilateral organization, particularly the IMF, we embarked on the medium-term revenue strategy. And in that strategy itself, it has looked at 3 main pillars on a tax policy. The other one was on the tax administration, and of course the legislation of our tax policy, tax legislations. I think in terms of the tax legislation, we had adopted pretty much since independence a lot of that from Australia, and we ended up with an income tax that was way thicker, and it was so complex to navigate through those very complicated, big legislation. So one immediate project that they needed to do there was to simplify that, and as a result, we have now redraft the Income Tax Act, more simplified, and out of that, they've separated the Tax Administration Act. So that's now sits aside, which deals with how administration of tax is legislated, and keeping the Tax Income Act, the principles maintained separately in a rewrite of that new act. Also in that space, we have also introduced what we call a separate tax regime for SME, small, medium size of businesses, because at the current regime, they were all applied, they were all subject to the corporate income tax. And so I think part of that in the work, in the space of the legislation, was bringing more of those things in place. But in terms of the tax administration and compliance efforts, I looked at the work that IRC has done, and they continue to do that. And that's where we see some benefits coming through. I think in the long run is to ensure that we broaden the tax base and limit some of those burden on those big tax head items, such as the personal income tax, which is one of the highest in the region. And that, of course, also has implications on the livelihood of the citizens as well. So on the revenue side, is looking at improving the compliance where we can broaden the tax base, where we can collect more revenue. And on the expenditure side, of course, is you got to balance this between making sure that the development needs continue to be you're making sure that essential core services are funded. That is your health, education, infrastructure, and law and order. You're making sure that continues to happen. And then you look at what we call a second priority or second tier priorities, where we try to apply a certain level of cuts, not entirely out, but a certain level of cuts, and look at activity items where those can be savings, expenditure savings of fiscal space, and also the room we can create. And all in together, making sure that we are within our medium-term consolidation path. Of course, you wouldn't want to go down very quickly. Your consolidation path has to be gradual, but not too rapid in a way that it has that the ramification happening. But it can unwind quickly. I guess the main objective around here is at this space and time, there is for a country like Papua New Guinea, it's developing. You want to make sure that your essential services, the development continues to be delivered, but at the same time, you want to ensure that that is in a sustainable level of, and so this becomes one of those challenges. But making sure, of course, the political economy is always there. Making sure that our leaders have just returned from the election, and they've promised a lot to the people, and it's some pressure for them to deliver as well. I guess having those balances in place, but in making sure they meet their attend to their constituency, their policies, they're able to deliver that, but within a framework that can be done. And I think getting our politicians to see this vision, to realize that, as well as the implications of this, and as I mentioned earlier, in terms of our strategy going forward, in terms of maintaining our debt as a sustainable path, is looking at the concessional borrowing a lot, and now a lot of focus is now towards grant financing. So it's very, very useful to have in the panel MCC, and it's very interesting for us to see that there is kind of facilities that Papua New Guinea may also be tapping in, and we're very much interested in looking down that path. So perhaps in this, I know I can continue to have the discussion after this. But in the broader sense, I think that's our strategy in terms of sticking with the fiscal consolidation path, but at the same time making sure that the political economy, those in charge around the government, also get to deliver their the political promise they had to their constitutions. Thank you.
Secretary. I guess in the interest of time, I just want to ask one more question, really about maintaining spending. With countries and international organizations emphasizing the importance of being able to maintain social spending, particularly in health and education, it's going to create challenges for countries to balance the need for meeting those commitments and making new investments, as well as social expenditures. So given the debt distress that we've already talked about, the scarcity of sustainable financing options, and the inflationary pressures that everyone is facing, how can countries balance the need for spending in these core services with the parallel need to cut back? Maybe Secretary, I'll turn first to you to talk about how PNG is managing that balance, and then to Alicia to see how MCC is looking at this.
Thank you, and that's it's a tough question in itself, and making sure the delivery of the core services is important, and so then we have to go down and look at the levels, the layers of where the expenditures are made, In a broader sense, we know that these are core services that social spending need to happen. But if you go into those services themselves, then you will realize that there are some activities that are carried out that in itself would have to be reprioritized as well. Certainly, for example, what we find is a practical thing that some health organization departments would have it's good to have symposiums and research and continue to have those, but certainly in a time when you're tight, then you have to make a choice between having those or you making sure that the drugs and the medicines and the nurses and doctors continue to be funded. So these are kind of some of those areas we look through and see where we improve the efficiency of spending in that space. And we'll look at the fringes where we can reallocate funding. But it is challenging. But making sure that at the end you don't you make sure that the cost of delivering those services are maintained in the terms.
Thank you, Secretary. I think we've caught all of your comments, but I'll just mention that we are having some interesting IT occurrences in the room. So, Alicia, maybe over to you. We can't see you. Oh yeah, now we can see you again. Great. It'd be great to hear MCC's perspective on some of this.
Yeah. So, I think the way that MCC is approaching it is that, because we are, financing in many cases large-scale infrastructure projects, and also in many cases public service delivery systems, and all of these things, we approach these kind of with the backbone of sustainability. And so I think the core of kind of how we work and how we kind of partner with countries is laid on that foundation. The other item I'd point out is that kind of how we even enter into the kind of model with the country is laying out that constraints analysis to economic growth in collaboration with the partner country. And so, in the end, if it is determined that, for example, that constraint is focused on education, that constraint is focused on WASH, then we'll move forward with programming in that area. And, we do have a couple of like very interesting current compacts that have education components in Morocco as well as in Cote d'Ivoire that are focused on technical vocational education training and building out these TVET centers in collaboration. In Cote d'Ivoire, it's actually in collaboration with the private sector, and in Morocco, it's with the government. So, so I do think we're kind of in a different kind of way. We're kind of supporting countries with these issues of having to kind of balance their needs with that kind of need to also at the same time cut back. And then I guess the final point I would make is just that our model also really focuses on building capacity for the governments. And so as I kind of mentioned in my presentation, it's the government, the partner government, that stands up an entity. And it's that entity that actually, over that 5-year period implements the programs. So, from their CEO all the way down, they run the procurements, they, focus on just that overall project management. And so I think our model is such that we're building the capacity in the governments, and this also allows, the governments to be able to kind of create that sustainability going forward. Thank you.
Super, thank you.
We have about 10 minutes left. I know it's very brief in terms of any questions that folks might have. I will say that Tim, as panelist, has asked for the privilege of asking the first question. So Tim, maybe I'll go ahead and give you that opportunity, and then we'll see if others have questions as well.
Mine is very quick. Alicia, I'll pass Secretary's details on to you if you don't mind, then, because he seems interested in our policy.
Absolutely.
Have you seen a big increase in requests in the last, say, 6 months for programs?
I'm sorry, I missed part of that question. A big increase in.
So have you seen a big increase in requests for threshold or compact programs in the last 6 months?
Oh, so I think it's pretty cyclical. So I think the answer to that is yes. I would say over the past kind of 6 to 8 months, I am definitely aware that my colleagues in that department have had kind of an increase in conversations. You know, and I think you know, given that it's our December board meeting that you know, kind of determines which countries will be selected. I think there's kind of that awareness of the timing, and so in the run up to that, trying to kind of see what's necessary in order to you know, meet the criteria and kind of fit within the parameters.
Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else have questions for the panel? Please come over here.
Hi, Fiona Ryan from Forest Development Climate. I was just at the COP27, and as usual, the COPs, a lot of people told me up green bonds and ESG bonds to get some sort of premium. I don't know how big a part of the international finance system they are, or what sort of answer they are to these things. And there was also this time a lot of talk about debt for nature swaps, and those things, I don't know, some people are a bit suspicious, saying, well, they're trying to pass their haircut on to developed country taxpayers, you know. So I was just wondering, yeah, what are those, you know, how significant are these ESG green bond type green, yeah, what's that? Debt for nature swaps.
Yeah, great question. Tim, I think you might be best suited to chime in first, and then I'll see if others want to weigh in.
I can't claim this is my specialist area, but there was something in Gabon recently where there was an arrangement for forest protection in exchange for paying out a sovereign bond. I think it was the Nature Conservancy. So I don't think that it's not a massive market at the moment. This is just a personal preference, but I was a little suspicious about earmarked funds. But that's because I work with budget processes, and anything that determines prioritization outside of a budget I dislike. But you know, I think there is a huge value in things like if I'm remembering right, what the Nature Conservancy did in Gabon, and it's something that I think other countries will look for. If developed countries are willing to set aside funds to say to developed countries at the moment, but we will help you pay out with a longer term instrument your sovereign bonds or your large market-based access bonds. In exchange, you reserve protected areas, or you increase taxes on forestry, or you whatever else it might take. You stop the export of ground logs, these sort of things. That I think has a lot of potential value and solves two problems at once. It solves the debt problem and it helps address the climate problem. How big a market is, I honestly couldn't say. But more governments have started putting it in as conditionality. The IMF, astoundingly, has started looking at this in conditionality programs. And I think when you win over the IMF to a cause other than just pure macro, we're on the right track. So, yeah, good luck.
Yeah, does anyone else want to weigh in on that, or should we move on to the next question? I don't see any particular emotion. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that we mentioned the word climate in the question section, because it has been a consistent theme in this meeting in Australia. And last night we heard from Professor Emeritus Admiral Nadam, who says we're very much in the era of adaptation now. He doesn't even go to COP27 because he says there's no scientific route to 1.5%. So if we look at this discussion with the climate lens, what suggestions do we have to change the tools, to change the development infrastructure that we're using, so that we're not just rearranging deck chairs, so to say, but we're really questioning the systems that we're applying? Does anyone have any comments on that?
Thank you for that question. Alicia, I wonder if I could turn to you to just talk about how MCC is looking at climate, you know, in the context of this question, and then see if others want to chime in.
Sure. So, I mean, I'll say just historically, MCC has always taken into account climate into the way that we kind of develop and design our compacts and threshold programs. And so kind of, you know, this kind of global pivot, you know, and focus on climate change has not been, you know, an onerous kind of activity for MCC, because we had already taken it on. And so I would just note that, you know, some of the ways that we're, you know, focused on incorporating climate change into our work is, you know, things from using materials to support decarbonization, for example, looking increasingly at off-grid renewable energy projects. Our current programming in Benin actually has an off-grid component. And then also just, you know, for some developing a pipeline of biomass projects as well. So I think, you know, in many ways, we're already kind of in that space and looking at ways to make sure that we're doing things in a cleaner way, things that kind of enhance and support the environment. And it's not exclusive, for example, to our energy focused work. It's also, for example, in our transportation work, where even, for example, in the regional Benin Niger transport compact, where there's going to be, one of the projects will be a focus on fleet renewals for the trucks. And so this will allow for, you know, cleaner trucks, which will ultimately, you know, help the environment. So I think, you know, just holistically as an agency, we've always kind of looked at ways to make sure that we're adhering to things that will, you know, support the environment.
Thanks. Any other thoughts from the other viewers on this?
Yeah, Katie, I will just add quickly to this that it's like a lot of other intersectional, cross-sectional factors, you know, that the way we look at climate and the new, the development projects or infrastructure, we need to incorporate this lens, you know, to every project, especially the governance reforms. What we see is climate catastrophes, for example, flooding in Pakistan, and we saw 1/3 of the country's land mass was underwater. This was, and then we look at the causes, climate is one. So no matter how much funding the country may receive in response to the flooding, it's not going to address the climate issues unless the climate is incorporated into the governance reform projects. How, for example, urbanization is planned, how the licensing is issued for property development, how the settlements are planned. So incorporating these elements throughout the governance projects would be one way where we can provide for at least some of the big sums that addressing climate change would need.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that insight. I'm afraid we are out of time. Really appreciate everyone's attendance and especially to the panelists for their insights and thoughts on this subject, and also to ANU for their support. So thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.